Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. Each year, over 24 million people come into contact with police officers. How? During traffic stops. This is according to federal data, and this makes this one of the most common ways that people encounter law enforcement in America. As we've seen in study after study, it's disproportionately people of color who are pulled over, searched, and subjected to violence during these stops. There is a reason people use the phrase driving while black, and that reason is the disproportionate rate at which black drivers are contacted by law enforcement. Now, amid the nationwide conversation about racist police abuse and over-policing, a number of jurisdictions have begun debating plans to address this funnel of law enforcement contact. They want to think about the role that traffic enforcement plays in these issues and consider shifting traffic enforcement duties away from armed officers and toward new civilian units. The basic idea is simple. By civilianizing traffic enforcement, advocates believe we can eliminate a key driver of discriminatory policing and also, perhaps more critically, reduce violent and sometimes deadly police encounters that stem from these stops. Possibly also, this would free up police to focus on more important duties. Now, in Florida, State Representative Omari Hardy recently introduced the most ambitious proposal of its kind so far, with a bill that would take armed cops off traffic enforcement across the entire state. Now, under Hardy's proposal, each city and county in Florida would be required to create a public safety department by July 1, 2023. These departments would have distinct operational divisions with different public safety functions. Armed law enforcement would continue to have a role in upholding public safety, but by creating new departments for traffic enforcement, crisis response, and intervention, and of course, integrating emergency call answering and dispatch, the bill would empower civilian specialists to carry out many of the duties that police are currently taking up a lot of time and resources on. Even though, as we described above, police don't do these duties very well, and it creates a lot of opportunities for violence. So for more on this proposal and the debate over civilianizing traffic enforcement, I'm joined now by State Representative Omari Hardy. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Emily.
So let's set the scene for our viewers. I would love for you to describe, before we get into the specifics of your proposal, what traffic enforcement by armed police officers currently looks like in Florida, how people experience it, particularly how Black and brown people in Florida experience that enforcement, and why you feel it's necessary to overhaul the system.
Well, those are some great questions, a lot to chew on. I like to say that police officers are overqualified to spend their time citing people for rolling at stop signs or for running red lights. And in addition to their being overqualified for that, which means that there's nothing that they're trained to do that gives them a unique ability to do that. They're trained to do so much more than that. In addition to them being overqualified to write traffic citations, they also present the danger of escalating a traffic stop into a deadly encounter. We saw that in the case of Philando Castile. We saw that with Miss Sandra Bland. Right. And so here you have these people who are doing something that we don't need someone carrying handcuffs, a gun, and a badge to do. And who also, frankly, given what they're trained to do, it's quite capable they could escalate a situation, a nonviolent situation could turn violent. I felt that it's necessary to ask the question, well, why do we need them to do that? And can we accomplish the same thing without the police? And I feel that that's possible. And I wanted to think it through. And I wanted to present a blueprint, not just for folks in my state, but for folks in other states that they could use to unbundle the police in their community.
So can you kind of walk us through the racial disparity that you see in Florida in particular when it comes to traffic enforcement?
Well, look, there's obviously something called driving while black, and you discussed that in the open. But, here are the facts. African Americans are pulled over on pretextual stops. Oftentimes when we're pulled over, that interaction with the police isn't even recorded because a citation may not have been issued. In each and every instance in which an African American is pulled over by a member of the police, there's an opportunity for that situation to turn south. I've seen it in my own community. not only the community where I grew up, not only the community where I went to college. I grew up in Broward. I went to college at the University of Miami. I've had my own experiences with the police, but I see that in my community in Palm Beach County as well. Corey Jones would have been a constituent of mine if he were not murdered by Officer Newman Raja. And that was a situation where he was pulled over on the side of the road and really needed assistance. But the guy who showed up with a gun, a badge that he wasn't displaying, by the way, and training in how to use force. And, unfortunately, he murdered Corey Jones that evening and was convicted of it. The first officer in 30 years in the state of Florida to be convicted for murder for conduct while on duty, right? And so I've seen it in my community. I've seen it growing up. I've had those experiences myself. And I just think it's important that we recognize that the status quo is broken and that we pursue an alternative.
So let's talk about the alternative that you've proposed. And I'd love, so often we can totally geek out in the policing conversation and use legal terms. I'd love for you to speak in the most lay terms possible about how your proposal would change this and how ordinary Floridian drivers and transit riders would experience that change.
Thank you. So here's what we know. Police unions often say that traffic stops are dangerous for officers. And if they're dangerous for officers, that they would certainly be dangerous for civilians. Well, you have to explore why they're dangerous for officers. They're dangerous for officers because when someone gets pulled over who has a warrant or who has something on them that they perhaps shouldn't have on them, drugs, what have you, they react with the knowledge that the person who's pulling them over is someone who has the ability to take them to jail, to take away their freedom. And so a lot of these combustible moments that result from a traffic stop where the person who is being stopped is responding negatively in a violent way towards the police, that comes from the fact that they know that this is a law enforcement professional who is probably going to take them to jail. And at that point, traffic enforcement is no longer traffic enforcement. At that point, traffic enforcement has turned into drug interdiction, has turned into serving felony warrants, right? And that's what makes traffic stops dangerous when they're not just traffic stops. So if you train people to do just traffic stops, if you give them uniforms and vehicles that are distinct from the police so that the public knows that this person who's pulling them over is not someone who's going to take them to jail if they see a bag of weed in the cup holder, then you inherently make the interaction much more safe because you lower the stakes. So that's the first step. You have to make traffic enforcement just about traffic enforcement. You have to make sure the public knows that. And then you have to make sure that the people who are doing traffic enforcement are not able to act as the eyes and ears of the police. It does no good to strip the ability to arrest a person from someone who's doing traffic enforcement. It does no good to strip them of that ability if you're going to empower them to call the police on the radio if they were to see marijuana in your cup holder. That does no good either. It doesn't solve the problem. So my bill would make traffic enforcement just about traffic enforcement. It would limit the ability of traffic enforcement monitors to communicate with the police about issues that are not inherent to the life and safety of people in the car. For example, someone who may be kidnapped or a child who may be abused. And it makes traffic enforcement, in a lot of ways, it enables them to automate traffic enforcement so that you don't even have interactions with individuals. And it requires, frankly, that the public safety answering point, your 911 dispatch, it requires that those personnel be trained so that they're not sending the police to do a job that an unarmed traffic monitor can do. And I think that makes the entire situation safer for the police because they're no longer involved in these combustible moments where they're trying to pull someone over for running a stop and it turns into a violent situation. And it also protects the public because they know that when I speed, that's all I'm getting a ticket for is speeding.
So let me pick up on something you just said, because I think this is a criticism that one hears a lot in the conversation around who does traffic enforcement, which is people saying but what if somebody gets pulled over and you hear banging in the trunk and there's a woman screaming, "Let me out, let me out." You're making it very clear that in your proposal that person, that traffic enforcement officer would have some capacity to defend themselves if attacked and also to call police if they, for example, came upon a kidnapping.
Yes, they would not only have the authority to do that, they would have the obligation to do that, right? So if the traffic monitor pulls over someone and it's clear that there is a violent situation occurring, someone's kidnapped, the child is being abused, or they're in the commission of a violent felony, or they've harmed someone while driving, they've hit someone, they've damaged property while driving. In those instances, my bill empowers and authorizes the traffic monitors to communicate with police officers at that time. But those are all situations where the crimes involved are directly related to public safety. It's not a drug crime. It's not, some other non-violent victimless crime. Those are crimes where we do need people whose role in society is to use force, non-negotiable force, and to detain individuals who are breaking the law and posing a danger to society, to the public. Yes, so that is preserved in the bill.
Let me ask you, knowing that, what responses are you hearing from your constituents? Are people in favor of this? Are you getting pushback? And what are the prospects for passing this proposal?
The wonderful thing about a legislature is that you have people from different walks of life, and you also have people from different districts. I had the benefit of being from a very safe blue district, where a majority of my residents are Black and Latino. And they have experienced what I have experienced and what many other people of color have experienced, and what many people of color fear that their children or their relatives might experience, which is unfair, unjust, and biased policing. And so my residents, thankfully, back me up on this proposal. Based on conversations that I've had, they're appreciative of the fact that I brought forward this idea that is more innovative than some of the other reforms that are being discussed in our state. And again, I did this not just for folks in my community, not just for folks in the state of Florida, but to provide a blueprint for what it looks like in writing, in black and white, for us to unbundle the police. Now, do I think that this bill is going to be heard or passed? No. We have a Republican-controlled legislature. Out of 120 seats in the Florida House, the Democrats only have 42, right? So I think, and by the way, it's not just my police reform proposals, and I have several that won't be heard and that won't pass, but there are much more moderated, self-negotiated reforms that have been proposed by members of my caucus that are also not being heard. So, my bill, which attempts to go all the way toward this idea of unbundling the police and reimagining public safety, is going to be just as unheard as the extremely moderate proposals that some of my peers have put forward. And so in that context, why not go all the way? I used to have a music teacher who said, you know what, if you're going to make a mistake, make a whopper of a mistake, but dang it, hit the keys. And this is, I think, the point here. We're not just governing for ourselves in this time. We are showing the difference between our side and the side that does not understand that the status quo is broken and that we need transformational change in policing. And to the extent that this proposal makes that difference crystal clear, I think it's advancing the conversation in a positive way.
So Representative Hardy, I did promise I would get you to your vote on time. So I'm going to ask you one last question. And the reason I'm asking this question is, in a Republican-controlled legislature, I do think that there's one aspect of this conversation that is heavily bipartisan, which is the conversation around public safety. I mean, most people agree that what people most want police to do is to focus on the worst crimes: homicide, sexual assault, things that cause profound harm. And as you and I both know, police spend a lot of time enforcing traffic rules, and that is time that cannot be spent on more serious crime. So I'm wondering if you could, before you go to your vote, just explain for us the argument of what might happen to police capacity and police focus if you were able to take traffic enforcement off their plates.
Thank you for bringing that up. Police officers say, when surveyed, that they often feel unqualified for some of the situations in which they find themselves. And it's not just with respect to traffic enforcement, it's also with respect to people experiencing mental health crises. They are not trained as mental health therapists. They're not trained in short-term therapy, crisis intervention, resource linkage, and things of that nature. And yet we're putting them in a situation to fail every single day. Because when folks call 911 and someone's experiencing a mental health crisis, it's the police who show up. And they are telling us that they feel uncomfortable in these situations. That's why you get the situation, which we've seen play out in so many cities, where someone's having a mental health crisis, a family member calls because they want medical help, they need some short-term therapy, they need some resource linkage, and a police officer shows up. He's not well prepared. He comes with the tools that he or she comes with: a gun, a badge, a taser, mace, and a tragedy ensues. Because we're putting these police officers in situations to fail. Why should a cop be there, right? And so what this bill does is it basically acknowledges what police officers say about their own work conditions, that they're not qualified to do some things, and that for some things they're overqualified. And it allows them to focus on the things that they are good at, the things that they are trained to do, the things that I think most people who study this situation understand it's their role to fulfill in society. Egon Bittner, criminologist, has written some foundational texts. But one of his insights was that the role of police is to exercise non-negotiable force in society, right? And that is what police officers do. So why are we having them pull people over for running a stop sign, or for going too slow, or for driving too fast, or whatnot? That is not about criminal justice. That's a civil matter. We shouldn't have them doing that. And so, yes, I think this bill responds to what police officers say about their work conditions. I think it frees them up to focus on the things they're good at. I look at the situation, perhaps as a policymaker, perhaps the same way that a coach in basketball or football looks at coaching their team. If you're a coach, you want to put your players in situations where they could succeed based on their talents, their skill sets, and what they've worked on in their game, no matter what the sport. And the same thing here. We want to put police officers only in those situations in which they are prepared and trained to succeed. And we have to keep them out of situations for which they are not well prepared. And frankly, that's what this bill does. And it does it with traffic enforcement, and it does it also with crisis response and intervention.
Well, Representative Hardy, I know you have to go do legislative things, but thank you so much for stopping by and for having this conversation with us. I wish you the best of luck. I know you said this is not going to pass, but thank you for having this conversation and raising this really important issue. And we look forward to hopefully having you back soon.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you for having me. And I hope that folks all over the country, at the local level, at the state level, and even at the federal level, recognize that we don't need to tinker around the edges with respect to police policy. We need transformational reform. We really need to rethink and reimagine public safety beyond policing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I love that last thing that Representative Hardy just said. We don't need to tinker around the edges of policing in America, because it's true. If any other public city or county employee was causing the death of people, harming people, killing people at the rate that police kill Black and brown people in America, they would be an international emergency if bus drivers were taking lives. But with policing, there is a tendency, in spite of massive, ceaseless violence and harm and death, to tinker around the edges. I want to reflect for a minute on what Representative Hardy said about what he would do if he was the basketball coach of the police, which is take the things away from the players that they're not good at. Think about someone's talent and capacity. And when he thinks of police talent and capacity, he's thinking of serious crime. He's thinking of violent crimes. He's thinking of homicide and sexual assault, and not, as he put it, whether someone is driving too fast or too slow or rolling through a stop sign. It's very interesting to think about the comparative advantages here, about whether other people, better trained people, might have a comparative advantage when it comes to traffic enforcement or responding on mental health calls. Representative Hardy told us that police themselves assert that they are not the best professionals to respond to these types of things, that they themselves admit that others may be better situated to take 911 calls for traffic enforcement or mental health response, crises of that kind. If we were willing to go beyond tinkering around the edges of policing, we would not have seen deaths like those mentioned by Representative Hardy of Sandra Bland, Philando Castile. Traffic stops are a major driver of police contact, and contact itself is a risk to Black and brown lives. It is discouraging that he believes that this bill will not have a chance to pass in the state of Florida, but encouraging that the conversation is happening in Florida and across the nation, as we have been covering here on the Appeal Live, as we've been talking about a lot. So I hope you will continue this conversation with us and think about what might happen in your state. This has been another episode of the Appeal Live. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. Thank you so much for joining us.